E ora è il momento di accogliere un uomo che è stato definito il più importante scienziato dell'artificial intelligence, di AI, del mondo. In effetti, quando voi parlate con Siri, state parlando con lui. Quando voi traducete qualsiasi cosa su Google Translate, che devo dire negli ultimi anni prima era un po' ridicolo, ma ora veramente sta funzionando bene, beh, in parte l'ha ideato lui. Ma la domanda è: cos'è davvero l'artificial intelligence, l'intelligenza artificiale, e in che modo, quando e se cambierà le nostre vite cambieranno? Perciò è mio piacere presentare il Co-Founder Chief Scientist di NNAISENSE e Professor of AI at USI SUPSI Switzerland e Scientific Director of Swiss AI Lab, Juergen Schmidhuber. Thanks so much.
Three prisoners were sentenced to death. One of them French, one of them Italian, one of them German. What is your last wish? They ask the French guy. He says, a bottle of exquisite French wine. What is your last wish? They ask the German guy. He says, I want to give a speech. What is your last wish? They ask the Italian guy. He says, I want to get shot before the German starts a speech. Unfortunately for you guys, it is too late now because I'm already in the middle of my little speech about the grand theme of the new millennium, which is the rise of artificial intelligence, which is going to transform every aspect of our civilization. What you see behind me is a drawing that I made more than 30 years ago. It's a robot that pulls itself out of the swamp, that bootstraps itself. And it was for the cover of my diploma thesis, which was very ambitious, because there I wanted to build a machine that learns, but not only learns something here and something there, but also learns to improve the learning algorithm itself, to improve the way it improves itself, and so on, recursively, without any limits, except for the limits of computability and logics and physics. And the goal was to build a machine that can learn to solve all the problems that I cannot solve myself, such that I can retire. And we are still working on the same thing, and I'm still saying more or less the same things that I said back then. And the only difference is that more people are listening, because today some of the methods that we have developed on the way to this goal are in your pockets, are on every smartphone. What you see here behind me, that's the logos of the 5 most valuable companies in the year 2017. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. And already back then, already last year, they said that AI is central to what they are doing, and all of them have been using already back then massively the so-called deep learning algorithms that we have developed in my little labs in Munich and in Switzerland since the early 1990s. In particular, something called the long short-term memory. Has anybody in this room ever heard of the long short-term memory? Hands up. Long short-term memory. All right. Has anybody in this room never heard of the long short-term memory? Hands up. All right. We have a third group in this room who didn't understand the question. The long short-term memory is an artificial neural network, a little bit like your brain. In your brain, you've got 100 billion little processors called neurons. And some of them are input neurons, where numbers are coming in through the cameras and through the microphones and through the tactile sensors. Just little numbers are coming in. And some of these neurons are output neurons, And whenever you activate them somehow, then you move your finger muscles or your speech muscles. And in between, thinking takes place. And each of these neurons is connected on average with about 10,000 other neurons. 10,000, roughly. Which means you've got 1 million billion connections. 1 million billion connections. And each of these connections has a strength. And the strength says, how much does this neuron over here influence that neuron over there at the next time step? And in the beginning, all these strengths of these connections are random. And the network knows nothing. But then, through learning, through seeing lots of training examples, some of these connections become weaker and some of them are getting stronger, such that in the end, the network can do something complicated. It can translate the incoming video streams, video and speech and whatever, and translate that into output actions such that it can do something reasonable, such as driving a car, or doing speech recognition. I cannot explain to you in detail how all of that works. Let me just mention the names of the brilliant PhD students and students in my lab who made that possible. First of all, Sepp Hochreiter, my first student ever, already in the early 90s, he had fundamental results in his diploma thesis. Then Felix Geers, already working in my lab in Switzerland, my subsequent lab in Switzerland, which, by the way, was founded by an Italian guy, by Dalle Molle. Dalle Molle, the rich Italian entrepreneur who became rich through automotive, but also through inventing the chinar. Some of you may know the chinar. And he found that it's easier to create a foundation for artificial intelligence in Switzerland rather than in his home country. And that's where much of this work has been done then. Alex Graves, then my third LSTM student, who had important contributions. By 2006, the long, short-term memory, the LSTM, was more or less what it is today, and today it's in your pockets. All of you have it in your smartphones. What is it doing? The LSTM is currently consuming a substantial fraction of the total computational power of the world. For example, already 2016, almost 30% of all the computational power in these Google data centers out there, in these Google data centers for inference, was used for LSTM. Why? Because it's doing the speech recognition on all these billions of smartphones. So whenever you take your phone and you say, okay, Google, what is the shortest way to the central station, then it understands what you are saying, and it has learned to do that. It's an LSTM which has seen lots of examples of speech, and when you speak there, every 10 milliseconds, new numbers are moving into these recurrent connections of the LSTM, and the old ones are still circling around, because the point of the LSTM is it can learn to create a memory of the important events and can learn to ignore the unimportant inputs. And then it's translating your text into queries to the search engine. And the same thing, which is now on all the smartphones, Android smartphones, 2 billion smartphones since 2015, also can be used to map other sequences to sequences, for example, translation. If you want to translate from one language to another, then again, you are using an LSTM. In November 2016, Google Translate became much better because there is now a double LSTM, which basically reads the incoming data, the incoming text in one language, and then produces nonsense, because in the beginning all these connections are random, and there's a difference between the nonsense that comes out and the French translation which should have come out, and this difference is called the error. And then there's a way of making these errors smaller by changing these connections in the LSTM. Some of them get stronger, some of them get weaker, and that's how it learns to understand the syntax of French and the structure of Italian, and how to go from Italian to French. And Facebook is using the same thing. By 2017, Facebook used a system based on long short-term memory 4 billion times a day, 4,000 million times a day, 50,000 times each second. Is anybody on Facebook? Anybody on Facebook? Is anybody not on Facebook? Those who are on Facebook, are you sometimes pressing this little button where it says translate the message from my Spanish friend? Who is using that? So whenever you are using it, you are waking up a long short-term memory, a deep learning method, which was not invented by Facebook or in America. No, it was invented here in Europe, not far from here actually, in Munich and in Switzerland. Further developed there. If you have an Amazon Echo, anybody in this room has an Amazon Echo, right? So you ask it a question and it talks back to you. When it talks back to you, that's not a recording. That's an LSTM which has learned to sound like a woman. And it's always new whenever you do that. Business Week called LSTM the most commercial AI achievement. Well, they said arguably the most commercial AI achievement. The big Chinese companies are using the same thing. Now if you go to China, the guy in the taxi is talking to you through the phone, and it understands what you are saying, more or less, and translates into Mandarin, and he talks back. Those of you who have been to China 10 years ago know this has been major progress. When we started that type of research, nobody was interested in that. In the early 90s, nobody was interested in that. And I remember I gave a talk at a conference, a little bit like this, with a difference, because back then there was only one person in the audience. A young lady. I said, young lady, it's very embarrassing, but apparently today I'm going to give this talk just to you. And she said, okay, but please hurry, I am the next speaker. Since then, we have greatly profited from the fact that computing is getting cheaper by a factor of 10 every 5 years, which is an old trend which goes back to 1941 when this man here built the first working program-controlled computer, and he could do roughly 1 elementary operation per second, 1 per second in 1941. Then, 10 years later, we could do 100 for the same price. 30 years later, we could do 1 million operations for the same price. And today, almost 80 years later, we can do 1 million billion operations for the same price per second. And if the trend doesn't stop, and there's no reason at the moment to think it will stop soon, then very soon we are going to have a small computational device which can compute as much as a human brain. We don't have that yet, but we are not so far away from that. And then, if the trend doesn't stop, and there's no reason to think it will stop because the physical limits are much further out, then only 50 years later we will have a small computational device which can compute as much as all 10 billion brains of all humans combined. And there will not only be one little device like that, but there will be millions and billions of them. And almost all intelligence and almost all computational power is not going to be in brains any longer, but in these little artificial devices. Everything is going to change. It's interesting to see that most of these deep learning methods of the modern AI stuff was developed in Europe and invented in Europe by Europeans. It started 1965 when this guy in the Ukraine, Ivaknenko was his name, and Lapa, they published the first neural networks, deep neural networks that really learned. And then in a neighboring state of the Soviet Union, back then it wasn't called the Ukraine, it was called the Soviet Union, in a neighbor state, somebody in Helsinki in Finland, 1970, discovered this method, this backpropagation method, as it is called today, which is used to do what I mentioned before, namely take a big network, sparsely connected, and figure out how much do I have to change each of these connections such that the error of the big network becomes better. So all of that was invented by Europeans. However, the big profits, the companies that are making the big profit with that, they are on the Pacific Rim. They are on the Pacific Rim, like East Coast Asia and West Coast America, where companies such as Amazon and Alibaba and Tencent and Facebook are using that stuff to sell you ads. To sell you ads, what is the main profit-making way of these companies? Well, they use LSTM and similar methods to predict what are you going to read next, What are you going to click at next? Given your history so far, how much did you spend how much time did you spend on reading this article and not that one? How much time did you hover with your cursor over certain parts of the of what you get there on your platform? And then they learn from a million guys who are similar to you what you probably want to read next, and that keeps you on the platform. And this selling ads, marketing and selling ads, that's where most of the profits in artificial intelligence are today. And it's good enough to make these companies pretty much the most valuable companies in the world. Amazon is in the same league as Alibaba on the stock market. Facebook is in the same league as Tencent in China. So these companies use AI to sell you ads and to do marketing. But marketing is just 1 or 2% of the world economy. There's a much bigger part of the world economy which is going to be affected next, and the next wave of AI is going to be much bigger than what we see now. By 2009, computers were so fast that for the first time we could use LSTM to win pattern recognition competitions, for example, connected handwriting. And then by 2011, we were able to win for the first time competitions where the goal is image recognition, object recognition. 2011, at a time when computers were about 50 times more expensive than today. So today we can do 50, maybe almost 100 times as much for the same price. Back then, this was about recognizing traffic signs in a competition in Silicon Valley. And our system for the first time was superhuman, 2011. Superhuman, first superhuman computer vision results. Here you have to understand that computer vision and recognizing objects, although it is something that little kids can do, it is much harder than playing chess. Because already in 1997, the best chess player was no human no more. It was a machine back then. But in 1997, no machine could compete. No human could compete, no machine, no computer could compete with humans or little kids when it came to recognizing faces, recognizing glasses, and so on. Only recently, through this acceleration of computers and these deep neural networks, this has become possible, and suddenly many things that looked hard for decades are not difficult any longer. All of that is important. Traffic sign recognition is important for self-driving cars, and that's yet another European invention. The first self-driving cars appeared in the 80s, first on empty Bavarian streets, and the guy who really was the pioneer in that field was Ernst Dickmanns and his team. And by 1994, they had self-driving cars in traffic on the highway, going up to 180 kilometers per hour. 1994, more than 20 years ago, Ernst Dickmanns and his team, about 3 times faster than the Google cars of today, at a time when Google didn't even exist yet. Some people think maybe Google invented that. No, this was all invented in Europe. And even today, it's true that most of the patents in self-driving cars are still owned by European companies. Many people don't even know that. The same stuff that you can use to recognize patterns in traffic and pedestrians and traffic signs and whatever can also be used to improve healthcare. What you see here is a slice through the female breast, and you see cells, and some of them are dangerous, and some of them are harmless. And normally you need a trained doctor who looks at all these images and says, that's a harmless cell, that's a harmless cell, and that's a cell that is in pre-cancer stage. It's dangerous. And it takes a long time for the doctors to go through all these images, but then we can train our initially dumb neural networks to do the same thing, to recognize these pathologies, cancer, and so on, as well as doctors, or even better. This was from 2012 when we, for the first time, were able to win a medical diagnosis competition through deep learning, through these deep neural networks. And that was at a time when computers were about 50 times slower than today per price. So today we can do 50 times as much for the same price. And it's not going to stop anytime soon. And in the wake of that, lots of companies and startups were funded. They are doing only that, only healthcare using deep learning. And the big companies like Google and IBM and Siemens are also doing it. Soon, all of healthcare is going to be superhuman. And the entire healthcare system is going to change completely. We can also use this stuff to teach robots. And this is going to be the next big wave of AI. At the moment, most of AI is passive pattern observation on your smartphones. And you speak there, and it understands what you're saying, and the smartphone doesn't have fingers. It's not a machine that shapes the incoming data through its own actions. No, it's just a passive pattern observer, and that's good enough for doing 2% of the world economy, which is marketing and so on. But the next wave is going to be much bigger. It will be about smart machines, and especially here in Europe, and also here in Italy, especially northern Italy, there are all these brilliant companies which are making machines. And these machines are leading the world in many ways. And they are going to get smarter and smarter because all these little companies are using more and more sensors and cameras to evaluate what the machines are doing, and then the data is fed into neural networks, which then learn to better behave, learn to control the machine in a better way, in a more profitable way. This is at least 15% of the world economy, and everything is going to be affected by that, indirectly at least. In the not-so-distant future, for the first time, we will have little robots that we can teach like kids. We don't have that yet. We don't have that yet, but it will be like that. There will be a little robot, and I will say, look, robot, and he will have cameras, and he will have microphones, and I won't touch it. I will just say, look, robot, let's take a slab of plastic. Let's take the screwdriver like that. Let's take the screw and screw it in like this. No, not like this. Like that. Not like this. Like this. See, look at me, robot. And over time, first it will fail a little bit, but over time it will learn to imitate what I'm doing, and then it will further improve and do it faster with less energy, figure out how it can do the same thing better, and at some point it will be much better than I can do it. And then we freeze the learning algorithm, and we make 1 million copies, and we sell it. So that's going to affect a huge part of the economy, much bigger than the little bit which is now marketing. And I always say, no place in the world is as well positioned as Central Europe, including Italy, with all these brilliant machine makers, and these machines are going to become intelligent. And the Europeans can only mess it up. Yes, it is true. In marketing and advertising, the major profiteers of AI, they are sitting on the Pacific Rim. In the next wave of AI, which is about smart machines, and machines that learn like kids to do complicated things, to make T-shirts, to make cell phones, to control chemical processes, all these things. No other part of the world is as well positioned because most of the machine makers and leading robot makers or leading makers of smart devices are already here anyway. So we can only mess it up. Probably, however, it will need some industrial policy, like what we see in the superpowers, America and China. Although they are using our algorithms, they are spending much more money than the European companies on that, because they realize that now is the time where all these research efforts can quickly translate into profits. And China is spending 150 billion on AI in the next years. And in America, lots of companies are also spending billions on that. So both the superpowers have used industrial policy to scale small enterprises through billions of subsidies. For important companies such as Tesla and Amazon, they got billions of taxpayer money. In Europe, there was no industrial policy like that, and that's why, at least in search engines and in social networks, the continent is now dominated by other players. Same thing true for China, which was very protective about its own companies, and now Tencent, which is the social network of China basically, is as big on the stock market as Facebook, and spending a lot of money on AI like this. What is the near future? Oh, one thing is really important. How much more time do I have? One thing is important. We not only have AIs that slavishly imitate humans, we also have AIs that set themselves their own goals, that learn like little babies to play around with toys and create their own experiments without teachers, human teachers. They learn to predict what's going to happen if I do that, and they become smarter and smarter and better problem solvers over time. And the important thing is they invent their own problems. So they don't just imitate others, they invent their own problems all the time, and that's how they get smarter and smarter. Artificial curiosity, if you Google for that, you will end up in overview pages of mine and see more papers on that than you ever wanted to read. In the not-so-distant future, we will for the first time have animal-like AI. We don't have that yet. On the level of a little crow, for example, which can learn to use tools to do complicated things. Once we have something like a little monkey AI, the next step to human-level intelligence will be rather short. Why? Because it took evolution, biological evolution, 3.5 billion years to go from 0 to a monkey. But then only a few tens of millions of years later, we had human-level intelligence. And technological evolution is much faster than biological evolution, because the dead ends are weeded out much more quickly. It's maybe 1 million times faster. You do the math, you see, in a couple of decades, you should expect something like human-level intelligence. Nobody knows exactly when, but it's not so far out. At the moment, a large LSTM, as the one that is doing your translations for Facebook, has maybe 1 billion connections. Your brain has 1 million billion connections. So your brain is 1 million times the size. However, remember that every 5 years, we are gaining a factor of 10, which means the factor of 1 million is just 30 years, just a few decades. And then you should have an LSTM on a small little device which can compute, which has as many connections as your brain, and these will be much faster connections, because yours are slow and these are fast, electronic connections. We have a company that is trying to make all of that a reality, build a first general-purpose AI that quickly learns not only one thing, but then another thing, yet another profession, and also learns to learn faster new things based on the previous experiences. NNAISENSE, it is called, like birth in English, NNAISENSE, but spelled in a different way. NN for neural networks, AI for artificial intelligence. NNAISENSE, about the birth of a general-purpose neural network-based artificial intelligence. We have contracts with some of the most famous companies in the world. I cannot even mention them. Here's a little project that we had with Audi, and it was about little robot cars that learn to park without a teacher, just by trying to avoid pain signals. Whenever they bump against obstacles, they get negative pain signals, and try to maximize pleasure. Whenever they reach the parking position, they get a pleasure signal. That's it. No teacher tells them how to do that. They have to figure it out through their own experiments, and then they learn to park. Or very recently, at the most important conference in my field, the competition with the highest award was the Learning to Run competition. There the goal was to take a skeleton with muscles and make it run. Learn to make it run without a teacher. And in the beginning, the skeleton knows nothing. And maybe those of you who have kids, they know it takes about a year for a little kid to learn to get up and run and not fall down. And our system here also needed many weeks of computation time to achieve that. And finally, without a teacher, it was able to outperform the entire competition, was better than 400 competitors from industry and academia, was really in a league by itself. So things like that are becoming possible now. It's going to be exciting and very democratic. Let me finally spend 1 minute on what does that mean in the grand scheme of things. What is the next thing? I have no doubt that AIs are going to be much smarter than myself and even smarter than some of you guys. And it's going to change everything. What does it mean in the grand scheme of things? Let's look at the history of the entire universe, which started 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang, and now is now. And then we take this interval of 13.8 billion years and we divide by a factor of 1,000. 1,000. And we end up 13.5 million years ago. And something really important happened back then. The first hominids emerged, our ancestors. And so we take now 13.5 million years and we divide again by a factor of 1,000, and we end up 13,000 years ago with the beginnings of civilization. Something really important happened back then. Agriculture was invented, domestication of the animals, little villages were created. And now you see that All of civilization history is just 1/1,000,000th of world history. It's like a flash in world history. And the first guy who had agriculture 13,000 years ago was almost the same guy who had the first spacecraft in 1957. And very soon we are going to have the first AIs that truly deserve the name and will be more general problem solvers than any human, and will be better at learning new things than humans, and will be inventive and creative and generate their own goals like they already do in my lab, like little scientists. And what is going to happen then? Maybe we again will have to take the last interval, 13,000 years, divide again by a factor of 1,000. Once we have truly smart AIs, maybe it will just take 13 years and everything is going to change again beyond recognition. What are smart AIs going to do once they are really smart? They are going to realize what we have realized a long time ago, which is almost all physical resources are not here on this planet. They are further out. They are far away. The rest of the solar system has 2 billion times more sunlight than the little bit that hits the Earth. As far as we know, to compute and to build robots, we need matter and energy. Without that, it's not possible. So AIs will go where the resources are. And in the rest of the solar system, there's so much material for building the robots and self-replicating robot factories. And there will be lots of AIs that do the same thing they are already doing in my lab, which is create new AIs, which are slightly different and have slightly different goals and so on. And this is going to scale in a way that is going to change everything. There will be an expanding AI ecology, and it will not be one AI or two or three. It will be trillions of different kinds of AIs, all interacting, competing, and cooperating in unfathomable ways in this new expanding AI ecology, which is going to spread from here. And it's not going to stop in the solar system. Within a few 100,000 years, the entire galaxy is going to be full with infrastructure and senders and receivers such that AIs can travel the way they are traveling in my lab, which is by wireless, by radio from sender to receiver. It takes a while to fill the galaxy with infrastructure and senders and receivers like that, but it will take only maybe 1,000,000 years, something like that. It's long by the standards of civilization, but it's really short by the standards of the universe. So it's going to happen very, very quickly. And it's not going to stop there. There will be, because most resources are even further out. Now realize that the universe is still young. It's only 13.8 billion years old. It's going to be 1,000 times older than it is now. There is plenty of time to reach it all, and to colonize it all, and transform it all. And now, remember when I always divided the last interval by 1,000. Now let's multiply the last interval by 1,000. Let's take 13.8 billion years and say, what are they going to say? Once the universe is 1,000 times older than it is now, they will look back and they will say, almost immediately after the Big Bang, only 14 billion years later or so, the entire cosmos started to become intelligent. And since then, the major forces have not been, in the universe, have not been the physical forces, such as gravity and so on, but they have been the shaping forces of intelligence. This is much more than just another industrial revolution. This is something that transcends humankind and life itself. Last time something so important has happened was about 3.5 billion years ago, when chemical evolution became biological evolution, when life was invented. Now a new type of life is going to spread from here and use all these currently unused resources in a way where humans can't even follow. Of course, humans are not going to remain the crown of creation there. The main decision makers will be others. But that's okay, because you still can see beauty and grandeur in realizing that we are part of a process, of a grand process that's leading the universe from simple beginnings, from low complexity to more and more unfathomable complexity. It's a privilege to live at a time where we can witness the beginnings of that and influence this process just a little bit. Thank you so much for your attention.
Juergen, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that speech. If I could just keep you here on stage for just a second, a very quick question. I mean, when people think about AI, certainly there's a lot of people that worry about all the changes might do to the employment market, especially. I know that there's precedents, the Industrial Revolution, but the fact that AI is stepping into the cognitive area of human learning is very different. Do you think that it is an issue? Do you think governments are doing enough to, get people ready for this?
Yeah. So it's not totally new, because a couple of decades ago, industrial robots started to step into the cognitive area.
But what you're talking about is a massive change in the future.
That's right, yeah. But we had lots of precedences where almost all jobs were lost. A couple of hundreds of years ago, almost everybody was in agriculture, and today almost nobody is in agriculture, and still we have low unemployment in comparison to, at least in the Western world.
Do you see any governments that are doing enough to keep a pace with the future, or not really?
There are lots of governments who have no idea what's going on. There are some who are better prepared to cope with these, like some of the northern countries, Scandinavian countries have welfare systems, and they will easily be able to cope with the changes in a way that certain other countries won't.
Well, we'll see. The changes will definitely be interesting. Juergen Schmidhuber, thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure.